The language of the inscription is Sumerian. Sumerian is the oldest written language. It's not related to any of the Indo-European or Semitic languages in that part of the world.
The man who decoded humanity's first civilization spent his final days begging the world to forget everything he taught. For 50 years, Samuel Noah Kramer was the only person alive who could read the oldest written language on Earth. Every textbook, every museum, every lecture about where civilization began traced back to him. Then, weeks before his death, he stared into a camera and said 5 words that should have changed history. "We have gotten this wrong." His colleagues buried the confession. The transcripts were shelved, but the words survived. The confession, Philadelphia, 1988. A basement beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum. A 91-year-old man sits hunched over a table, fingers trembling, holding a tablet older than the Bible, older than the pyramids. His name is Samuel Noah Kramer. And right now, weeks before his death, "Before I die, please listen. We have gotten this wrong, not the details, the whole framework." The man who spent 6 decades as the undisputed authority on ancient Sumer just told the world that everything he taught might be fundamentally wrong. Not a detail here or there, the entire foundation. And what he discovered in those final years does not just challenge ancient history. It challenges what we think we know about human consciousness itself. The man who owned Sumer here is what you need to know about Kramer. In the 1920s, Sumerian was a dead language. No living speakers, no dictionaries, no instruction manual. Kramer taught himself, word by word, pattern by pattern. Over 6 decades, he became the only bridge between the modern world and humanity's first civilization. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions to a world most had never heard of. The first recorded love song, the first legal code, the first school system, the first creation myth. All of it decoded by one man in a Philadelphia basement. 90 degrees piled up. His translations filled every textbook. Students across the globe learned ancient history from his words. Whenever archaeologists anywhere on Earth dug up new tablets, they shipped them to Kramer. He was the final word. But here's the thing about being the only person who can read a dead language. Nobody can check your work. But here is the catch. Quietly, buried where almost nobody would look, Kramer had been leaving clues for decades that something was deeply wrong. The footnotes. Nobody read it, started so subtly that almost no one noticed. Go back to Kramer's academic papers from the 1960s and 1970s. Really read them. Not skimmed. Not pulled quotes. Every page. You would find something strange hiding in the footnotes. Tiny asides, almost whispered. A particular word has no exact English equivalent. Certain passages have meaning that remains obscure. Normal scholarly caution. Right? Every translator acknowledges difficulties. But here is what nobody caught. The footnotes were becoming more frequent, more troubled, year after year. A quiet alarm building in the margins of the most important translations in ancient studies. By the 1980s, Kramer wrote something that should have shaken every university department in the Western world. The more I study these texts, the less certain I become about their true meaning. His colleagues dismissed it. Faculty meeting whispers. Sam's losing it. Too long in the basement. An aging scholar becoming philosophical about his life's work. But Kramer was not being philosophical. He was being literal. He had noticed something about Sumerian thought that kept him awake at night. The Sumerian language had no word that clearly meant religion. None. No distinction between natural and supernatural. No concept of miracle, because it had no baseline of normal for miracles to violate. The Sumerians did not separate sacred from secular. These categories did not exist for them. And that word we confidently translate as God, it meant something closer to great power or cosmic principle. It was not clear the Sumerians worshipped these entities the way later cultures worshipped gods. It was not even clear they thought of them as beings. In 1987, Kramer said something that should have made international headlines. When I translate a Sumerian text about the creation of the world, I use English words like creation and world. But I am no longer convinced the Sumerians had anything like our concept of creation. I think they might have been describing something completely different. And I have spent 50 years putting their thoughts into categories they would not have recognized. If you are fascinated by discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew, subscribe now. Because what Kramer found next changed everything. The real crisis was not the footnotes. It was not the growing doubt. It was a single tablet, one he had translated 40 years earlier, one that was about to break him. The tablet that broke him. The tablet came from Nippur, one of Sumer's most sacred cities, dated to around 2100 BCE. It had been sitting in the Penn Museum collection for decades, translated, cataloged, case closed. Kramer had published his translation in 1949, a dialogue between a human and a god, the nature of knowledge, the origin of civilization. In his version, divine beings granted civilization to humanity as a gift. It fit the narrative perfectly. Translation published, career advanced. He moved on. But that tablet kept nagging at him. 40 years of something feeling wrong. In 1988, at 91 years old, Kramer returned to it one final time. His assistant, David, described what happened next. Kramer sat in that basement for 3 hours, just staring, turning the clay over in his spotted hands, dust catching in his wrinkles, not speaking, not writing, just looking, trying to forget his own translation, trying to see what the original Sumerian actually said. Then he stopped breathing. David said the color drained from Kramer's face like someone had pulled a plug. His lips parted, but nothing came out. 3 full minutes. No movement. No sound. David's hand was on the phone, ready to call an ambulance when Kramer finally looked up. His voice was barely a whisper. I've had it wrong. All of it. For 40 years. But here is the catch. What he found was not a small correction. It was a complete inversion. The word he translated as gift. It could also mean awakening or remembering. The word he translated as human. It could mean sleeping one or unaware one. The word he translated as God. It could mean fully conscious one or aware power. Read it again with those meanings. The tablet was not saying the gods gave civilization to primitive humans. It was saying civilization emerged when humans awakened to capacities they already possessed. That what we call gods might have been the Sumerian way of describing states of consciousness, modes of awareness, things we no longer access or understand. This was not a minor reinterpretation. This turned the entire text inside out. He showed it to colleagues, Dr. William Hallow at Yale, a man who had spent 40 years building on Kramer's translations. He reportedly went pale. Sam, this would invalidate everything. My books, my students' dissertations, all of it. Dr. Miguel Seville at Chicago was blunter. You need to rest, Sam. This isn't scholarship anymore. This is a breakdown. But Kramer could not let it go, because once he saw it, he could not unsee it. He went back through every major translation, text after text, and in every single one, the same problem. He had imposed modern categories onto Sumerian thought. He had assumed what the texts must mean based on what made sense to a 20th century mind. The real shock was not what one tablet said. It was what Kramer realized about his entire life's work. The consciousness collapse. In those final interviews, the ones they never wanted released, Kramer tried to explain what we had been missing, and each discovery was worse than the last. First, he looked at their math. The Sumerians used base 60. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Simple, obvious. But 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Mathematically elegant in ways base 10 cannot touch. Standard explanation. Clever mathematicians noticed useful properties. Kramer's question was different. What if base 60 was not a choice? What if it reflected how they actually perceived numerical relationships? What if their minds structured quantity differently than ours? Then he looked at their astronomy, and it got worse. They tracked planetary movements with breathtaking precision. Star charts accurate for millennia. Knowledge about cycles that Europeans would not rediscover until the Renaissance. Standard explanation. Patient observers over centuries. Kramer asked something no one wanted to hear. What if they were perceiving these patterns directly? Then he looked at their technology, and it got worse still. Irrigation systems of stunning sophistication, massive ziggurats, advanced metallurgy, urban planning, all appearing from nowhere around 4,500 BCE. And those tablets describing gods granting knowledge? What if they were not religious myths? What if they were describing sudden cognitive shifts that made certain technologies immediately obvious? But here is the catch. Kramer did not stop there. He looked at what happened when Sumer collapsed. Around 2000 BCE, cities abandoned, people scattered. Standard story, civilizations rise and fall, normal cycle. But Kramer noticed something in the tablets from Sumer's final centuries that no one else had caught. The later texts were different, not just in content, in the quality of thought. More concrete, more practical, less concerned with cosmic principles. It was as though the civilization was not just politically collapsing. It was cognitively declining. Whatever mode of consciousness made early Sumer possible was fading. The later Sumerians were writing like people who no longer understood their own ancestors. The famous king list showed the same pattern. Early kings with impossibly long reigns, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Later kings with normal lifespans. Standard explanation, mythology transitioning to history. Kramer saw something else entirely, a record of cognitive shift. What earlier Sumerians experienced as reign became something smaller, more limited, more like what later civilizations called kingship. In his final interview, weeks before his death, his voice was barely audible. I think Sumer's collapse wasn't a political event. It was a consciousness event. Something about how they experienced reality changed. And once it changed, they couldn't maintain their civilization. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes wet. We are their descendants, living in the aftermath of that change, trying to read their texts, but unable to understand them, because we are on the other side of the divide. What they buried with him. Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, 93 years old. His obituary celebrated his contributions to Assyriology, mentioned his translations, his books, his decades of achievement. It did not mention his late-life doubts. It did not discuss his final interviews. The academic establishment moved on quietly. His earlier translations stayed in textbooks. The narrative he helped create and then tried to tear down remained intact. But Kramer's doubts did not die with him. A small number of researchers in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology started picking up where he left off, questioning whether ancient civilizations thought in fundamentally different ways. Some have begun retranslating Sumerian texts with Kramer's late insights. Texts that seemed like religious myths become descriptions of consciousness states. King lists become records of different modes of existence. None of this has reached mainstream academia. Too many careers built on established interpretations. But the deeper resistance is personal. If Kramer was right, our entire story changes. We think we are the pinnacle. Technology, science, rationality. But what if the Sumerians were not primitive? What if they had capacities we lack? What if progress means gaining some abilities while losing others we cannot even name? The tablets are still there, in museums, in archives, covered in cuneiform we can technically read. But if Kramer was right, we are reading words while missing meanings, translating language while failing to translate consciousness. "Before I die, please listen," he said. "We have gotten this wrong. Not the details, the whole framework. And until we admit that our modern consciousness might not be capable of understanding ancient consciousness, we will keep teaching a history that never happened and missing a truth we desperately need to recover." The question is not whether Kramer was right or wrong. The question is whether we are brave enough to consider that the man who knew more about humanity's first civilization than anyone alive looked at everything he built and said it was not enough. That the real story is written in a language we have forgotten how to think in. And if that is true, then the most important discovery in human history is not buried in the desert. It is buried in us. So here is my question. Do you think Kramer was right? Are we reading ancient texts with a mind that can no longer understand them? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe. We are uncovering secrets like this every week. Trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next.